The moment I stepped into that courtroom, my daughter Melissa gave a nervous little laugh. Her husband, Gregory, glanced at me and shook his head like I was some confused old man who had wandered into the wrong room. Then the judge looked up. His expression changed. The color drained from his face. His fingers froze over the papers in front of him, and for several seconds he didn't say a word. Then he leaned toward his microphone and whispered 2 words. The scalpel. Gregory's smirk disappeared. Melissa stopped breathing. They had come to court expecting a 71-year-old man they could label senile, take control of, and quietly strip of his independence. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But before we get deeper into this story, if you haven't subscribed to Chronicles of Vengeance yet, this is the perfect time to do it, because what happens next is where the story really begins. And trust me, you won't want to miss what Nathaniel discovers. My name is Nathaniel Price. I was 71 years old, retired, widowed, and, according to my family, harmless. For nearly a decade, I'd lived in a guest house on property owned by my daughter and her husband, or so Gregory believed. After my wife, Isabel, died, I sold our home in Connecticut and moved to Los Angeles to stay close to Melissa and my grandson, Tyler. I thought I was protecting my family. Instead, I had made myself easy to overlook. At Sunday dinner, Gregory talked about his Ohio resort project like he was already a billionaire. Contractors, investors, permits, the whole 9 yards. He barely acknowledged me. Tyler was different. My 16-year-old grandson still treated me like a person. When he invited me to his playoff game, I smiled and started to answer. Gregory cut me off. Don't bother your grandfather. He needs his rest. He chuckled. Dad's getting old. Melissa laughed along with him. I didn't argue. I'd spent years believing silence was a mature thing to do. I was wrong. 3 days later, Gregory came to my guest house carrying an expensive bottle of wine. I couldn't drink. My doctor had warned me against alcohol after my bypass. Gregory knew that. The bottle wasn't a gift. It was theater. He sat across from me and explained that his Ohio resort needed a temporary cash injection. $500,000, he said. Just a bridge loan. 6 months, tops. He promised to return $700,000. I listened. Then I said, no. His smile vanished. You're sitting on money while my family's future is on the line. Your business isn't my responsibility. His jaw tightened. Then he leaned forward. You live here because we're letting you. That was when I finally looked him straight in the eye. Actually, Gregory, I said quietly, you live here because I allow you to. He laughed. He thought I was confused. He had no idea the land beneath his mansion had been purchased by me decades earlier through a family holding company. When Melissa wanted to build a house, I gave him permission under a long-term family agreement. Gregory had never bothered to read the paperwork. That mistake was about to cost him dearly, because the next morning, Gregory started asking Melissa questions about my health, then my medications, then my memory. By the end of the week, they weren't talking about my money anymore. They were quietly building a case against my mind, and I noticed every single thing. What they didn't know was that noticing patterns had once been my profession. For 30 years, I had worked as a federal forensic financial investigator, specializing in corporate fraud. I followed money through shell companies, false invoices, hidden accounts, and fabricated records. I didn't destroy people. I exposed them. And somewhere along the way, prosecutors and investigators gave me a nickname, the Scalpel. I had retired from that life decades ago. But Gregory Walsh had just made one very serious mistake. He had given me a reason to pick up the scalpel again, and I still hadn't discovered the most dangerous part of his plan, because within days, my daughter would help him put something in writing that could change my life forever. They were preparing to convince a judge that I was no longer capable of controlling my own affairs. And they were about to learn that the old man they thought was forgetting everything hadn't forgotten a thing. The evidence they thought would break me. The next morning, Melissa came back to my guest house with a folder tucked against her chest. She didn't bring coffee. She didn't ask how my chest felt after the night before. She sat across from me and opened the folder. Dad, I think we need to talk about your memory. I looked at her. My memory seems fine. She smiled, but their necks was no warmth behind it. What day is it? Monday. Who was president when you were born? I answered. Where did you go yesterday? The hospital. She nodded and wrote something down. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a conversation. It was documentation. Someone wanted a record of my answers. I asked, who told you to start doing this? She hesitated. Gregory's just worried about you. That's not what I asked. She closed the folder. I love you, Dad. Then she left. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the closed door. My daughter had just questioned my memory like I was a child, and I knew exactly what they were trying to build. Not a medical diagnosis, a narrative. Over the next few days, the little thing started. Gregory began telling people I'd forgotten appointments that I'd never scheduled. Melissa mentioned that I was becoming confused about money. A grocery delivery I'd never ordered arrived at my door, and later Gregory casually asked why I'd been spending so much. Then I noticed something worse. My desk had been disturbed. Nothing valuable was missing, but several financial papers had been moved. Someone had been searching. I didn't confront them. That would have been stupid. Instead, I started keeping notes. Dates, times, names, every strange incident. The habit came naturally. 30 years earlier, I'd done the same thing while working federal financial crime investigations. My job had been to follow money through complicated fraud networks. A single unexplained transfer could lead to a shell company. That shell company could lead to another. And eventually, one tiny financial inconsistency could expose an entire operation. That was how I earned the nickname the Scalpel. I didn't threaten people. I didn't intimidate them. I found the evidence they thought nobody would notice. And I had spent enough years doing that to recognize when someone was constructing a false story. The next piece arrived on Thursday. A lawyer called me. He said he'd received an inquiry concerning my financial capacity. I hadn't hired him. More importantly, I had never authorized anyone to investigate my finances. I asked who had contacted him. There was a pause. Then he gave me the name of a law firm, a firm representing Melissa and Gregory. I thanked him and hung up. Now I knew this was bigger than family tension. They were preparing something legal. That afternoon, Gregory brought a doctor to my guest house. Dad, this is Dr. Peter Lim. We just want to make sure you're okay. I shook the man's hand. He asked me several questions. My medications, my finances, my recent activities, my relationship with Melissa. Then he asked whether I believed Gregory was trying to take my property. I smiled. Why would you ask me that? He didn't answer. He simply wrote something in his notebook. I watched him carefully. He wasn't conducting a normal conversation. He was looking for confirmation of a conclusion he'd apparently already reached. Before leaving, he said I should consider a neurological evaluation. I agreed. That surprised him. Of course, I said. If there's something wrong with me, I'd like to know. After they left, I checked my records. Dr. Lim wasn't my regular physician. He had never treated me before. So why had Gregory chosen him? That question bothered me. Then another one did. Why had someone already contacted a lawyer about my mental capacity before this doctor had even examined me? The sequence was backwards. The legal concern came first. The medical justification came afterward. That wasn't how an honest investigation worked. It was how someone built a case. That night, I opened a secure room hidden behind my bedroom closet. I had created it decades earlier, when my federal investigations began attracting attention from people with money, influence, and very good lawyers. I hadn't used it in years. Dust covered the old equipment, but everything still worked. I opened my retired case files and began reviewing the tools I'd once used to trace financial crimes. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking at someone else's conspiracy. I was looking at my own family. Then I found the first thread, a name connected to Dr. Lim, and that name led somewhere I never expected, because the man they had chosen to question my sanity wasn't simply connected to Melissa and Gregory. Someone had been paying attention to him long before I ever heard his name. I wrote Dr. Peter Lim on a yellow legal pad. Then, underneath his name, I wrote one word, money. That was where I always started. People could lie about their intentions, They could rehearse their stories. They could even manufacture concern. But money was hard to control. I opened a secure computer I'd used for years during federal investigations and began with Lim's professional history. Dr. Lim was a legitimate physician. That was important. He wasn't some random man pretending to be a doctor. His credentials were real. But his recent financial activity didn't make much sense. There were consulting payments from companies that had little obvious connection to medicine, small transfers, repeated deposits from the same corporate network. Nothing alone proved corruption. So I didn't make an accusation. I followed the trail. One company led to another. Then I found something familiar. Walsh Holdings Group, Gregory's company. I sat back in my chair. That was the first real connection. A payment from a Walsh-controlled account had gone to a consulting company connected to Dr. Lim shortly before Lim began evaluating me. The amount was $25,000. Not enough to prove a crime. More than enough to ask questions. I printed the transaction and placed it in a folder. Then I turned my attention to Gregory. His Ohio resort had sounded impressive at the dinner table. The financial records told a very different story. Construction costs had exploded. Several contractors were demanding payment. The resort's financing was under pressure, and Gregory had taken on a mountain of debt. Then I found a number that explained everything. $500,000. That was the immediate amount Gregory needed to satisfy a short-term funding requirement and keep his resort's larger financing package from collapsing. The $500,000 wasn't the entire problem. It was the deadline. If Gregory couldn't make that payment, his lenders could trigger a much larger default. And behind that default was a $5 million emergency capital call. Now his visit to my guest house made sense. He hadn't been offering me some amazing investment opportunity. He had been buying time. My money was supposed to keep his project alive long enough for him to find another solution. When I said no, his options narrowed. So I looked at what he could reach without my permission. My property, my accounts, my estate. And suddenly, the conservatorship plan looked less like an act of family concern and more like a financial strategy. If Gregory and Melissa could convince a court that I was incapable of managing my own affairs, they could seek legal control over those affairs. They wouldn't automatically own my property, but they could potentially gain authority over my finances. That was enough. I opened the property records. The mansion, the guest house, the surrounding acreage, all of it traced back to a family holding company I had established years ago. Gregory had never bothered to understand the arrangement. He thought because he lived in the mansion, he owned the world around it. He didn't. I made another note. Motor confirmed. But then I found something that hurt more than anything Gregory had done. A financial account connected to the Isabel Price Foundation. The foundation had been created in memory of my late wife. Melissa helped manage it. I opened the transaction history. There were payments I didn't recognize. Consulting fees, administrative expenses, transfers to companies connected to Gregory. I stared at the screen. Then I saw Melissa's authorization. Her name was attached to the transactions. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I wanted to believe she had signed something without understanding it. Maybe Gregory had pressured her. Maybe he'd told her the money was legitimate. Maybe she thought she was protecting our family. I wasn't ready to condemn my daughter. Not yet. But I couldn't ignore the evidence either. That was another lesson from my federal career. You don't decide what the evidence means before you finish collecting it. 30 years earlier, that principle had earned me the nickname the Scalpel. I had been a senior federal financial crimes investigator specializing in corruption, corporate fraud, shell companies, and hidden money. One of my most famous cases involved a powerful executive who had buried millions through 6 layers of shell companies. Everyone thought the money was gone. I found one duplicated invoice. I followed it through the network until the entire structure opened up. The executive went to prison. The case made my reputation. That's when a prosecutor named John Carmichael first called me the Scalpel. He'd been a young federal prosecutor back then. Sharp kid, good instincts. He once told me, "You don't chase the whole body, Nathaniel. You find the artery." I smiled at the memory. Then I looked back at Gregory's records. There was another name, Citadel Apex Capital. The firm was financing part of Gregory's Ohio project. I recognized the name, but I didn't know why it was involved yet. I wasn't going to invent a connection, simply because the name felt familiar. So I made another note: investigate Citadel Apex. Then I returned to the Foundation records. One transfer bothered me more than the others. It had occurred shortly before the attorney contacted me about my financial capacity. That timing was too precise. I pulled the original authorization. Melissa's signature was there. My daughter had not merely stood beside Gregory. She had started moving money. I closed the file. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether Gregory was manipulating Melissa. I was wondering how much she already knew. And there was one more question I couldn't shake. If Gregory had only needed $500,000 to keep his resort financing alive, why had they gone to the trouble of building an entire legal case against me? The answer had to be bigger than one payment. So I followed the money one step further. And what I found next suggested that Gregory's financial problems were only the surface of something much deeper. Someone else had a reason to keep his Ohio project alive. The name I thought I'd buried. Avery! What do you already know? There was silence on the other end. Then she lowered her voice. First, tell me you're alone. I looked around the secure room. I am. Good. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't something you should discuss over a normal phone. I leaned back in my chair. What happened? You remember the Price Foundation? Of course. Someone requested a confidential file connected to it 3 months ago. My fingers tightened around the phone. Who? We don't know. Then why are you calling me? Because the request was made using information only someone familiar with your old work would know. I didn't speak. Avery continued. And Nathaniel, the request came before your daughter started asking questions about your finances. That changed everything. 3 months. Before Gregory's visit. Before the $500,000. Before Dr. Lim. Before anyone had mentioned my memory. I looked at the documents spread across my desk. This isn't about Gregory's resort. I said, I don't think so. Then what is it about? I don't know yet. For the first time since this began, someone had given me an answer I respected. She didn't know. That was better than pretending. I asked her to send me everything she could legally share. She hesitated. There may be a problem. What kind? Someone already knows you're looking. I stopped. How do you know? Because yesterday, someone asked me whether you contacted me. My office suddenly felt very quiet. I turned toward the door. Nothing moved, but I had learned long ago that danger rarely announces itself. I told Avery we'd speak again through a secure channel. Then I ended the call. I didn't return to the Citadel documents. Instead, I returned to the one thing I knew better than anyone, the financial structure. Gregory's resort had been financed through several layers of debt. Citadel Apex Capital sat near the top of that structure, but not at the very top. There was another investment vehicle above it, a company with no employees, no obvious physical office, and almost no public history. That caught my attention. I searched its formation records. The company had been created less than a year earlier. I pulled the ownership documents. The names were hidden behind another holding company. I couldn't identify the ultimate owner yet. That was frustrating, but frustration was useful. It forced you to slow down. I printed the records and placed them beside the old case file that had first taught me how dangerous layered ownership could be. 30 years ago, I had investigated a corruption network built on almost the exact same structure. Shell company, holding company, investment vehicle, private lender, beneficial owner hidden at the end. The structure didn't prove the same people were involved, but it was familiar, too familiar. Then I noticed something I had missed earlier. A Citadel Apex document contained a phrase used in the old investigation. Not the same numbers, not the same company names, the same unusual legal language. I searched my old records. There it was, a memorandum from the investigation that had made my reputation. And at the bottom was a name, John Carmichael. I stared at it. John had been a young federal prosecutor when we worked that case. He had believed in the evidence. He had stood beside me when powerful men tried to bury it. After the case ended, our careers took different paths. I became an investigator. John eventually left prosecution and entered private practice. I hadn't spoken to him in years. I didn't know whether he had anything to do with Citadel Apex, and I wasn't going to assume he did. But now I had a reason to find out. I reached for my phone, then stopped. Something was wrong. The room felt different. I looked toward the desk. My old Scalpel case file was open. I was certain I had closed it. I walked over slowly. Nothing appeared to be missing. Then I noticed the folder's position. It had been moved approximately 2 inches. That might sound ridiculous. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. To me, it meant everything. I knew exactly how I'd left it. Someone had been inside my secure room. I checked the door. Locked. The hidden access panel showed no damage. Whoever entered hadn't forced their way in. They had known how to get inside. I stood completely still. For days, Gregory had treated me like a confused old man. Melissa had questioned my memory. Dr. Lim had searched for signs of mental decline. But now I knew something they didn't. Someone was watching me, and whoever was had just made a mistake. They had touched the one file I hadn't opened in 30 years, the file containing the investigation that earned me the name The Scalpel. I closed the folder. Then I smiled, not because I was happy, because I finally knew the game had changed. They no longer thought I was harmless. They knew I was investigating. And if they were frightened enough to enter my private office, then I had finally found something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. I picked up the phone and called Avery again. She answered immediately. I didn't waste time. Avery, find everything you can on Citadel Apex Capital. She went quiet. Then she asked, why? Because I think someone connected to my past is standing behind my family's future. And before she could respond, I heard another voice outside my guest house. Gregory. He was talking to someone. I couldn't make out the words. Then I heard one sentence clearly. Don't worry. He still thinks this is about the money. I looked at the open case file. They were wrong. I knew it wasn't about the money anymore. And now I was going to find out exactly what they were trying to hide. The people behind the money. The next morning, I returned to the secure room before sunrise. I couldn't stop thinking about Melissa's words. The people behind this aren't Gregory. If she was telling the truth, then I had been looking at the wrong target. Gregory was desperate, but desperate men don't always build sophisticated financial structures. Sometimes, they simply become useful to someone who already has a plan. I opened the property documents Avery had given me. The development approval was recent. I hadn't known about it because I had never pursued commercial development on the land. As far as I was concerned, it was part of my retirement estate, something I intended to leave untouched. Someone else had clearly looked at it differently. The approval increased the property's potential value substantially. More importantly, the land sat close to the expansion zone connected to Gregory's resort project. Suddenly, the Ohio development wasn't just a failing business. It was sitting beside an opportunity. I drew 3 circles on a piece of paper. My property, Gregory's resort, Citadel Apex. Then I added a 4th, the Price Foundation. I stared at the page. Avery had given me documents, but she hadn't solved the puzzle. That was my job. I went back through the financial records myself. The foundation had transferred money to companies connected to Gregory. Gregory had borrowed heavily against the resort. Citadel Apex held a significant position in the project's financing, and someone had researched my estate months before any of this became a family argument. The pattern was there, but I still didn't know who was behind it. Then I noticed something I had overlooked, the timing of the foundation transfers. They weren't random. Each one occurred shortly before a new financing milestone in Gregory's resort project. The foundation wasn't simply losing money. It was being used to keep specific parts of Gregory's operation moving. I wrote one sentence. Melissa may not understand the entire scheme. That mattered, because I didn't want revenge against my daughter. I wanted the truth. If Gregory had manipulated her, I needed to know. If she knowingly helped him, I needed to know that too. There was no room for assumptions. I called Avery. I need one thing. What? Don't investigate anyone else for me. Just get me the original documents concerning the foundation and the property. She paused. Why? Because I don't want another investigator. I want the raw evidence. She understood. Fair enough. After we ended the call, I opened Gregory's financing documents again. One phrase caught my eye: debt restructuring through an affiliated investment vehicle. I had seen that structure before. Not the company, not the names. The structure. A lender sits above a project. A second entity buys part of the debt. A third entity holds a collateral. By the time anyone tries to identify the person ultimately benefiting, the ownership trail becomes a maze. 30 years earlier, I had spent months dismantling a corruption network built on a similar architecture. But this wasn't the same network. The names were different. The companies were different. The transactions were different. What was familiar was the design. Someone had learned how to hide money more carefully. That realization bothered me more than finding a direct connection would have, because it meant whoever was behind this understood the methods investigators like me used to expose financial crimes. I opened the old case files, one document after another: bank records, corporate filings, interview notes, federal subpoenas. Then I found a photograph. A much younger version of me stood beside a young prosecutor, John Carmichael. I remembered him immediately. He wasn't a financial mastermind. He wasn't a criminal. He had been one of the prosecutors who helped bring down the network. But there was something in the old file I'd forgotten. A handwritten note in the margin. John had written, "They'll rebuild the structure somewhere else." At the time, I thought he was being cautious. Now I wondered whether he had simply been right. I searched the old case designation. The internal name was Project Meridian. I opened the final report. One company listed in the investigation had survived after the case ended. It had changed names, then ownership, then jurisdiction. The trail eventually disappeared. I searched the latest corporate records. Nothing. Then I searched the company's former subsidiaries. One result appeared: a historical filing. The name had changed again. I leaned closer to the screen. Citadel Apex Capital. I didn't move. I didn't celebrate. And I didn't call Avery. Not yet, because this wasn't proof that Citadel Apex was criminal. It could be coincidence. The company could have inherited an old financial structure without knowing its history. Someone inside the organization could be using the architecture without the company's leadership knowing. Or the structure could have been deliberately preserved. I needed evidence, not theories. I printed the filing. Then I heard a soft sound behind me. A floorboard. I turned. The secure room was empty, but the door was open. I had locked it. Slowly, I walked toward the doorway. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing appeared disturbed, except one thing. The old Project Meridian file was lying on the floor. I picked it up. A small piece of paper had been placed inside, for handwritten words. "Stop digging, Nathaniel." I stared at the message. Then I smiled, because whoever had written it had just made the same mistake people had made 30 years ago. They assumed a warning would make me stop. They didn't understand the reason I had become the Scalpel in the first place. Threats never stopped me. They only told me where to cut next, and now I knew exactly where to start. John Carmichael, the man who knew my past. I didn't call John Carmichael that night. That would have been too easy. If someone was watching my investigation, contacting the one man whose name had just resurfaced in my old files would tell them exactly where I was looking. So I waited. Instead, I called Avery. "Pull every public record you can find on John Carmichael." There was a pause. "You think he's involved?" "I think I need to know what he's been doing for the last 30 years. The next afternoon, Avery sent me what she'd found. John had built an impressive career after leaving federal prosecution. He joined a major law firm, represented financial institutions, advised investment groups, and eventually became a senior legal advisor connected to several private investment operations. Then I saw the name, Citadel Apex Capital. I stared at it for several seconds. That still wasn't proof of anything. John could have been advising them legitimately. Citadel Apex could be completely clean, and the financial structure I'd recognized could have been nothing more than a common investment strategy. I had spent too many years in federal investigations to confuse suspicion with evidence. So I went back to Project Meridian. This time, I wasn't looking for names. I was looking for what happened to the assets after the case ended, buried in an old appendix. I found a company called Meridian Asset Recovery. It had been created to manage assets seized or recovered during the investigation. After the case closed, some of its holdings were transferred. Years later, the company was acquired. Then its remaining assets were folded into another investment structure. I followed the trail through several legal changes. Different names, different owners, different addresses. But one investment vehicle eventually appeared in the chain. A vehicle connected to Citadel Apex. I leaned back. That was significant. But it still didn't prove Citadel Apex was involved in anything criminal. The firm could have purchased assets without knowing their history. That distinction mattered. So I wrote 3 possibilities in my notebook. Inherited, compromised, deliberate. I wasn't going to choose one until the evidence forced me to. Then I noticed something strange. The old Meridian assets weren't simply being held. They were being used as collateral in modern financing arrangements. The same basic architecture had survived. Not the same criminals. Not the same companies. The same architecture. Someone had learned how the old system worked. And someone was using pieces of it again. I closed the file. Then my phone rang. John. I answered. Nathaniel. John. His voice sounded tired. I heard you've been asking questions. People seem to know a lot about what I'm doing. That should concern you. It does. There was a long silence. Then I asked, are you connected to Citadel Apex? I've advised people connected to them. That isn't an answer. No, it isn't. I appreciated the honesty. Then give me one. He exhaled. Citadel Apex isn't necessarily the problem. That caught my attention. Necessarily? Don't assume the company itself is behind this. Then who is? I don't know. You're avoiding the question. Because I don't have enough evidence. For the first time, John sounded like the prosecutor I remembered. Careful, precise, unwilling to make a claim he couldn't prove. I asked about Project Meridian. What survived? More than we realized. Give me something concrete. He was silent for a moment. Meridian Asset Recovery. I looked at the file on my desk. You know about that? Yes. What happened to it? Parts were acquired by legitimate investors. Some of the assets eventually entered larger investment structures. Citadel Apex? Another pause. Some assets associated with the old structure eventually passed through entities connected to Citadel Apex. I didn't say anything. John continued. That doesn't make Citadel Apex criminal. I know. Good. Because someone could be using legitimate institutions to move money without the institution itself knowing what's happening. That was exactly what I'd been thinking. Then I asked, why are they interested in my estate? John's voice became quieter. I don't know. But you know something. I know that your property has become more valuable. I looked toward the window. The development approval. Yes. How did you know about that? I've seen the preliminary filings. That answer bothered me. How? I can't explain everything over the phone. John. Nathaniel, listen to me. If your daughter is listed on a conservatorship petition, don't assume she wrote it. I froze. You've seen the petition? I've seen references to it. From whom? I can't tell you. Then tell me this. Is Melissa working with them? I don't know. That answer sounded genuine, and somehow it made the situation worse. John continued, but if her name is being used, there's a good chance she isn't the person controlling the strategy. I remembered Melissa's face, her fear, her hesitation, her warning. Maybe she had crossed lines. Maybe she had signed things she shouldn't have. But perhaps she wasn't the architect. I asked John one final question. Who are the people Gregory owes? He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, private lenders. Which ones? I can't name them yet. Can't or won't. Both. I almost smiled. Some things about John hadn't changed. Then his voice dropped. But you need to understand something. What? Gregory's debt isn't just a business problem anymore. I waited. Those lenders believe your assets can solve it. The call ended. I sat alone in the room. Gregory needed $500,000. His lenders wanted much more. My land had suddenly become valuable. My estate was being examined months before the family confrontation, and someone had begun building a legal case designed to place my financial affairs under someone else's control. The pieces were finally starting to fit, but I still didn't know who was moving them. Then Melissa arrived. She looked exhausted. "Dad, we need to talk." I didn't offer her a seat. "About the petition?" Her eyes dropped. "You found it." "I did." I wasn't supposed to. That sentence told me more than she realized. Who prepared it? Gregory's attorney. Who told him to prepare it? I don't know. Melissa. She looked at me. "I swear, Dad, I don't know." I studied her face. She wasn't acting like someone who had everything under control. She looked terrified. "Then why did you sign anything?" Tears filled her eyes. "Because Gregory told me you were getting worse." "And you believe him?" At first. She looked away. I saw the doctor's report. "Dr. Lim's report?" She nodded. "He said you were showing signs of cognitive decline." I kept my voice calm. "And after that, I started noticing things." "What things?" "You forgot appointments. You repeated questions. You seemed confused about some financial documents." I stared at her. They had been watching me. And worse, they had been creating situations designed to make me look confused. "Melissa," I said quietly, "how many of those incidents did Gregory arrange?" She didn't answer. That was answer enough. Then she whispered, "Dad, I think I made a terrible mistake." I stepped closer. "What kind of mistake?" She looked toward the door. "The kind you can't undo." Before I could ask another question, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Her face went pale. "What is it?" She handed me the phone. A message had appeared from an unknown number. "Stop talking to your father." I looked at Melissa. She whispered, "They know we're talking." And suddenly, the threat wasn't aimed at me alone. It was aimed at my daughter. I handed the phone back. Then I understood something important. Whoever was behind this didn't need Melissa to be loyal. They only needed her to be afraid. And if fear was the weapon they were using against my daughter, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I had to find out what Gregory had threatened her with before the people behind him realized I was already 3 steps ahead. The scalpel cuts deep. I looked at the message on Melissa's phone again. "Stop talking to your father." Then I looked at my daughter. For years, I had believed protecting family meant shielding them from the ugly parts of life. That morning, I finally understood something different. Sometimes protecting someone means helping them face the truth, even when that truth hurts. "Melissa," I said, "you told me you didn't know who was behind Gregory." "I didn't." "Then why are you looking at me like you just remembered a name?" She swallowed. "I found something 3 nights ago." "What?" Gregory left his laptop open in his office. He'd been working late. I wasn't trying to spy on him, Dad. I was looking for the documents about the resort. And there was an email from Gregory? No. She looked toward the door. It was from a private office I'd never heard of. My attention sharpened. What did it say? "I don't remember every word." "Then tell me what you remember." She took a breath. "It mentioned the resort. It mentioned your property. And it mentioned someone named Richard Voss." The room seemed to get colder. "Richard Voss." She nodded. I hadn't heard that name in 30 years. But I remembered him. Project Meridian. The financial architect who had built the network behind the network. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. He understood money. He understood corporate structures. And most importantly, he understood how to make dirty money look ordinary. We had never caught him. Not completely. I looked at Melissa. What else did the email say? It said Gregory needed to follow the competency strategy before moving forward with the property structure. My jaw tightened. The competency strategy? She nodded. That was a phrase. Suddenly, everything became clearer. The medical evaluation, the manufactured confusion, the conservatorship petition, the pressure on Melissa, Gregory's financial crisis, the development rights. None of it was random, but I still needed proof. I called Avery. "Come over." She arrived within the hour. I told her what Melissa had found. Avery didn't react dramatically. She simply opened her laptop. Do you have access to Gregory's email? Melissa nodded. Can you legally provide the message? I can give investigators what I found. Good, Avery said. Then don't touch anything else. That was the difference between suspicion and evidence. We weren't going to break into anything. We weren't going to manufacture proof. We were going to preserve what already existed. Avery eventually found the email through the records Melissa had lawfully provided. There was no dramatic confession, no message saying, I am the mastermind. Instead, there was one short instruction. It came from an intermediary company connected to Voss's private office. The message read, proceed with the competency strategy. Once control is established, move to the property structure. Below it was a reference to Gregory's resort financing. And beneath that, a coded project number matching one of the financing documents Avery had already uncovered. I stared at the screen. That, I said, is the connection. Avery nodded. It ties the legal strategy to the financial strategy. Exactly. The conservatorship wasn't being pursued because Gregory genuinely believed I was incapable. It was being pursued because someone wanted legal control over the assets. Now we had the first direct evidence. But I still didn't want to accuse Citadel Apex. A legitimate institution could have been used without its leadership knowing the entire scheme. The real question was, who was directing the structure? We followed the money, not the names. The trail moved through intermediary companies, private accounts, consulting arrangements, and investment vehicles. It didn't lead directly to Voss. It took time, 6 intermediary entities, 3 financial accounts, several layers of ownership. But eventually, the structure narrowed, and there he was, Richard Voss, the same man who had escaped Project Meridian 3 decades earlier. Only this time, he had made one mistake. He had left a trail. I called John Carmichael. I have Voss. There was a long silence. Are you certain? I have the evidence. I sent him the relevant records. Minutes later, he called back. This is enough to get investigators moving. Not enough for a conviction. No. Good. John paused. What do you mean? I don't want a dramatic accusation. I want the entire structure. He understood. You want the whole network. I want everyone connected to it identified. That was how the final investigation began. Not with a raid, not with threats, with subpoenas, financial records, corporate filings, medical billing records, communications, property documents. Every piece had to be verified, and slowly, the structure collapsed. Dr. Lim's payments were exposed. The attorney's involvement came under scrutiny. Gregory's financial arrangements were examined. The foundation transfers were documented. The development rights negotiations were uncovered. And the Voss communication connected the legal strategy to the financial objective. Meanwhile, the conservatorship hearing arrived. Gregory's attorney presented a petition. Dr. Lim described my supposed decline. They talked about confusion, memory problems, financial recklessness. But this time we had the timeline. The petition had been drafted before the alleged decline. The medical evaluation followed the financial crisis. The foundation transfers had already begun, and the email showed that the competency strategy was part of a larger property plan. The judge listened carefully. Then he looked at Gregory. Mr. Walsh, when was this petition first prepared? Gregory's attorney attempted to answer. The judge stopped him. I asked Mr. Walsh. Gregory swallowed. I don't remember. I almost smiled. The irony was difficult to miss. The man who had tried to convince everyone that I couldn't remember was now struggling to explain his own documents. The judge reviewed the evidence. Then he turned toward me. Mr. Price, 30 years ago, I was a junior prosecutor assigned a Meridian case. Now I understood why he'd recognize me. I remember your testimony, he continued. You were called the Scalpel. The courtroom went completely quiet. He asked, Do you know why? I looked at Gregory, then at the documents. Yes. I paused, because I never attacked the whole body. I looked back at the judge. I found the smallest weakness and followed it straight to the truth. The judge nodded. Then he denied the emergency conservatorship request. He ordered the evidence preserved and referred the suspicious financial activity for further investigation. The court had stopped the immediate attack, but the larger investigation continued. Weeks later, the petition was formally dismissed. Dr. Lim's professional credibility collapsed under scrutiny. Gregory's resort financing unraveled. The project was placed under court supervision, and Gregory lost control of the resort he had risked everything to build. His financial situation deteriorated rapidly, and investigators began examining his role in the fraudulent transactions. Melissa cooperated. She admitted the documents she had signed. She admitted the foundation transfers. She admitted that she had believed Gregory's story before realizing what was actually happening. She wasn't innocent, but she wasn't the mastermind either. And Richard Voss? The trail eventually reached him. It passed through the intermediary companies, through the financial accounts, through the communications, through the development structure, and finally through the instruction that had connected everything. Proceed with the competency strategy. Once control is established, move to the property structure. Investigators now had enough to act. Richard Voss was arrested after the financial investigation connected him to the network surrounding Gregory's resort and the attempted takeover of Nathaniel's assets. The man who had escaped Project Meridian 30 years earlier had finally left enough evidence behind to be found. Months later, I stood outside my house. The property was still mine. The foundation was operating under independent oversight. Gregory's resort was no longer my problem, and Melissa was slowly trying to rebuild the trust she had nearly destroyed. I looked toward the guest house. Behind one wall was the room where I had kept my old federal files. For 30 years, I had believed that room belonged to another version of me, a younger man, a federal investigator, a man who spent his life exposing people who believed money could bury the truth. But perhaps that man had never disappeared. He had simply been waiting until someone gave him a reason to return. I closed the door to the secret room. I didn't need it anymore. The truth had done what it always does when given enough evidence. It had cut through the lies. My daughter tried to have me declared senile because she believed I was too old to fight back. Gregory believed desperation gave him the right to take what wasn't his. Dr. Lim believed a paid opinion could become reality, and Richard Voss believed 30 years was enough time to erase his past. They were all wrong. Age had slowed me down. It had made me more cautious, more patient, but it had given me something they couldn't manufacture: experience. And experience had taught me one thing. You don't have to destroy your enemies. You don't have to threaten them. You don't even have to touch them. You simply have to follow the truth until there is nowhere left for them to hide. My name is Nathaniel Price. They call me the Scalpel. And when they try to cut me out of my own life, I cut straight through their entire conspiracy.